This is Deep into History, and I'm your host, Arjun Hundal. To start this episode, and as a way to introduce you to our full cast of villains, or heroes depending on your point of view, we'll take a journey back through the mists of time and witness the death of a titan. With our modern eyes, we may be tempted to see him as just an emperor, king, or particularly gifted warlord. What we must force ourselves to realize is that he achieved something that is impossible in our world, in our time. While still alive, he transcended his humanity and became a god, worshipped by tens of millions. From Egypt to India, every culture had their version of his name, like Iskander, Alika Sundara, and Sikandar, just to name a few. He took a large and professional army that his father had built and did what for hundreds of years it seemed impossible. He brought the mighty Persian Empire to its knees and subjugated its people. From his mother, he learned of her family's descent from Achilles and grew up understanding that she expected him to outshine his illustrious ancestor in everything he did. He learned about philosophy and art from Aristotle. He learned the art of single combat from Parmenion, an exceptional warrior. And he mastered military strategy at the side of King Philip II of Macedon, his father. He grew up in the viper's nest that was politics of the ancient Greek world and always remembered what his mother Olympias taught him, that serpents fear lions. His conquest took him on a decade-long odyssey from Greece to Egypt to faraway India. In the process, he took down the greatest empire the world had ever known. So take a deep breath, put some smoke in the air if you choose, and prepare to dream with me as we journey back to the year 323 BC, deep into the ancient metropolis of Babylon, and witness the death of Alexander I of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great. Ready? Then let's go. You are standing in the most opulent room that has ever existed. It has always served as the royal bedchamber of kings and emperors, set high in the ziggurat of Nebuchadnezzar. From the gardens on the vast balcony come the sounds of birds tweeting as they bathe in the fountains and play in the pools. The midday sun illuminates the room and is amplified hundreds of times by the gold leaf and jewels that cover the walls and ceiling. Because of this, though you stand inside, you stand in daylight. On the bed in the center of the room lays your king, and a man you once counted amongst your dearest friends. You love him with all your heart, only slightly more than you have come to hate him. You had ridden with Alexander since the beginning. You were of an age, and though you had not studied with the then prince, you had trained with him. You had known each other for more than 25 years, had been as close as brothers for a time, but then you had come to see an ugly side of the man, a side that only a few years before you would have sworn didn't exist. Now seeing him splayed out on the bed, the sheets soaked with his sweat, and his barely audible ramblings being recorded by sycophantic Persian scribes, it all sickens you. Son of Zeus indeed, you scoff out loud, but it's barely a whisper. Seeing the fawning courtiers fighting for the honor of wiping sweat from his brow reminds you of the moment you believe it all went wrong. 8 years ago, just after defeating the huge Persian army at Gaugamela, the Persian king Darius fled the field after Alexander and his companion cavalry had charged straight at him. In his camp, he had left behind his family and many of his advisors and courtiers. Instead of executing the officials, Alexander had ordered that they were to serve the surviving members of the Persian royal court. Not long after, he married 2 of Darius's daughters and absorbed their courtiers, counselors, and servants, making them his own. Their constant fawning, endless praise, whispers of jealousy and treachery had led Alexander to execute one of his father's oldest friends and his childhood teacher, Parmenion, along with his son for an imagined assassination plot. Worse followed as they insisted that to win over the population of Persia and much of its empire, it would be easier if they saw him as a god, in the same way that the Persian kings were the earthly representatives of the sun god Ahura Mazda. In Alexander's case, they sent word throughout the empire that he was the son of Zeus, and through his mother descended from Achilles, a demigod, who as Hercules before him would ascend to Olympus upon his death. It certainly worked. Rather than fighting him as the army moved east towards India, many independent tribes bowed, dropped to their knees, and submitted themselves in worship of him. In their minds it was simple. It took a god to dethrone a god. Priests from the temples of Memphis and faraway Egypt sent scrolls detailing Alexander's descent from the Egyptian god Osiris. Other priests from Greek temples in Asia Minor argued that his sire must have been Apollo Farstriker, for his conquest knew no limits. There was a problem though. After a while, Alexander began to believe it. He changed. He acted, thought, and spoke like he was a god. Even you, once his most loyal friend, began to distance yourself from his royal court filled with Eastern sycophants, soothsayers, and astrologers. The unrivaled general who once slept in the mud with his soldiers had adopted the ways of Persian kings and only slept in a royal pavilion full of silk pillows, women, delicacies, and casks of wine. Though he had led the army himself, always the first over the walls of a fortress or charging into the fiercest fighting on the battlefield, the same as he ever did, after the battle he stayed away from the common soldiers. Men who had been on campaign with him for years, men who he began to treat like strangers. Perhaps it was because he knew no Greek or Macedonian would ever bow down to him as a god. Many of the older men had seen him as a boy running around his father's army camp like an informal mascot. They loved him. He was their king, and more importantly, their comrade and friend. But they would never worship him. After a decade of nearly non-stop wars and conquests across thousands of miles and deep into India, the men finally said enough. They wanted to go home. They missed their families, and through conquest were now all rich men. It was time for them to enjoy lives as wealthy estate owners, either back in Macedon or anywhere in the now vast empire. They were sick of war and would march no further. Alexander berated them, screamed, yelled, threatened, and threw tantrums with his unit commanders for days. But in the end, he, the god, was forced to agree to abandon his plans to push further east. What happened next forever diminished him in your eyes. Instead of backtracking the way you had come, through conquered and friendly lands with plentiful supplies, he insisted on the flimsiest pretext that the army marched through the Gedrosian desert. You know why he chose such a perilous path. He wished to punish his men for daring to mutiny. What was so sadistic about the route was that it was the camp followers that suffered the worst harm. Thousands died, many of them families of the soldiers who had married while on campaign. His loyal subjects. You will never forgive him for that. Upon reaching Babylon, he and his courtiers and sycophants went on an excessive binge of drinking and feasting, which came to an end when Alexander complained of stomach pains before falling into a near comatose state. That was 6 days ago. Gathered around the room are most of his generals and high-level commanders, along with the heavily pregnant and stunningly beautiful Roxanne, the Bactrian princess who Alexander had named his queen and carried as heir. Though she tries to hide it, you can see she's been crying. She looks far more worried than most people in the room. She still loves him, you think. She has not yet realized what he has become. Around her stand the generals, Alexander's diadochi. First, the huge burly warrior Antigonus One-Eye, overall commander of the phalanx, the backbone of the army. Next to him, Ptolemy, commander of Alexander's companion cavalry. He looks every inch the son of Philip II of Macedon. He should, for all know that he is Alexander's bastard brother. He is speaking quietly with Perdiccas, the logistical genius who had ensured the army was always fully supplied. Just beyond them are the old wily warrior Antipater and his son Cassander, both staring down at the king and speaking quietly to one another. Suddenly Alexander sits upright in bed, sweat pouring in rivers down his face, his eyes wide open, staring at something no one else in the room can see. Then he falls back into his silken pillows. Everyone rushes to gather around the bed. Alexander, Ptolemy says, you are very sick. We must know your wishes in case you die. Who will rule? Asks Antipater, his voice concerned, almost fatherly. Alexander's bloodshot eyes circle the crowd. For an instant, you think you see something resembling contempt or hatred in them. Then he raises one finger and looks like he's going to point to someone, but his strength fails him and his hand falls limply to his side. You and everyone else crowd suffocatingly close to the bed to hear him say, just above a whisper, the strongest. His eyes close, and with a hiss of releasing breath, Alexander the Great is gone. Everyone in the room, but particularly the diadochi, the generals, are eyeing one another, almost suspiciously. In seconds you can see eyes narrow in calculation. The strongest? What does that mean? Who? Asked Antigonus One-Eye, and the room burst into discussion. Certainly not me, you think. While you command an entire wing of the phalanx and have ridden with the companions, you are the least senior of Alexander's generals. Then you see it in a flash, that spark of contempt, perhaps even hatred in Alexander's eyes seconds before he dies. He hates us for continuing to live. He wants us to kill each other for control of his empire, and these men will. If he can't rule, he would rather let the empire burn. The world would be torn apart. You see it as clear as day. Yet for the moment, the other generals are still acting as brothers and comrades. You look at his corpse, his sweat reflecting the reflected light in the room. In death, at last, he does look like a god, for his skin glows gold. In that glow, you've worked out your next move. You'll ride far to the east and take command of the units you know will follow you, and then wait and see what the strongest do. Though you are not the strongest, you are among the smartest. As Roxanne lets out an ululating tribal death cry, warning the gods that one of their own is returning to Olympus, you think, I can play this game because I'm smarter than them. The generals don't know it yet, but civil war is coming. Roxanne takes a deep breath and cries out again, and you think to yourself, no one will ever call me Seleucus the strongest. But one day men will call me Seleucus the victor. Let the smell of burning incense leave you, the cries of Roxanne and the weeping courtiers recede, and let Alexander's glowing body fade away. Come back to Deep into History and hear me say, "This is the tale of the most titanic battle the ancient world ever knew. There had never been a battle to finish by two more professional and deadly armies. The tale of the battle to see who would rule Alexander's empire and where an eagle got its wings. The tale of men who considered each other brothers but were turned into deadly enemies by a lust for power. The saga of the final stages of a vicious civil war that had gone on for 2 decades and caused the deaths of untold hundreds of thousands. The battle that would settle many old scores and signal the coming end of the Wars of the Diadochi, that poets named the Funeral Games. So take a deep breath and relax as we go deep into the year 301 BC and the Battle of Ipsus. Welcome to the closing ceremonies." This was the intro to this month's Patreon-only episode, The Closing Ceremonies. If you'd like to hear the full episode, please go to patreon.com/deepintohistory and sign up. Each month you'll get an exclusive Patreon-only episode and access to a growing library of older exclusives. It's just 10 cents a day, and it means the world to me. It helps keep Deep Into History alive, and I really need your help. That's patreon.com/deepintohistory. Thanks for listening. I truly look forward to the next time we go deep. Take care, my friends.